Do you know anything about the interesting work of towing gliders? And did you know that you can get paid to do it, either as a fun side job or as a way to build time? It turns out you don't need a lot of hours to qualify to tow gliders, so stick around as we talk with Jason Stevens, who will tell you what you need to know to land this fun job. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation. My name is Max Trescott. I've been flying for, 50 years. I'm the author of several books and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. And my mission is to help you become the safest possible pilot. Earlier in the week, in episode 325, we talked about how to start an approach at a waypoint marked as an IF/IAF, and when you have to fly a hold at that fix. And we talked about the crash of an SR-22 in which the pilot failed to fly the required hold. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/325. And if you're new to the show, welcome. Great to have you here. Please join us. And if you would take a moment right now and touch either the subscribe key, or if you're using the Apple Podcast app, the follow key. That way next week's episode will be downloaded for free. But first, let me remind you, this is a listener-supported show. It's supported by people just like you. And we've got several new ways that you can show your love and support for the show. So please, if you would, take a moment to go out to our new support page at aviationnewstalk.com/support and sign up to support the show, either as a one-time donation or hopefully as a regular ongoing donation. You'll find links to Patreon and PayPal where you can make ongoing donations, or you can also make one-time donations via Venmo, Zelle, or PayPal. Coming up in the news for the week of April 22nd, 2024, ForeFlight can now report turbulence in near real time. The FAA has new requirements for Part 135 charter operators, and we'll tell you about the total number of new eVTOL designs in the industry. All this and more, and the news starts now. From AOPA.org, new ForeFlight layer shows turbulence. A new feature from ForeFlight leverages the company's Sentry ADS-B receivers to show where aircraft are actually encountering turbulence. Pilots in search of smooth air can use pilot weather reports and forecasts to help choose a route and altitude, but forecasts don't show actual conditions and PIREPs are subjective. The new reported turbulence layer displays automated turbulence information recording by Sentry and Sentry Plus receivers, including where flights are in smooth air. The new layer shows smooth air as a series of gray dots along an aircraft's flight path. Yellow, orange, and dark orange dots indicate light, moderate, and severe turbulence, respectively. Tap on a dot to show the reporting aircraft's altitude, airspeed, and type, and the age of the report. Although the FAA defines levels of turbulence from light through extreme, pilots' interpretations vary. By contrast, the levels of turbulence for ForeFlight's new features are determined by an algorithm. Altitude sensors within the Sentry devices measure and record the level of turbulence throughout the flight, and the receivers upload the data whenever an internet connection is available. The more Sentry devices in the air, the more data available to pilots, and currently there are tens of thousands of units. Factors such as aircraft size and speed affect the level of turbulence experienced, so this data is displayed for each report. ForeFlight said the data is anonymized and derived from what ADS-B out-equipped aircraft are already sharing. A demo of the feature on a recent afternoon showed a cluster of training traffic in Florida and dotted lines crisscrossing the country. An altitude slider to the right of the screen filters in 3,000-foot increments in the lower altitudes. Pilots with Performance Plus subscriptions can also display turbulence in profile view to aid in selecting an altitude for the smoothest ride. Reported turbulence is available for Pro Plus plans and above as 2 subscription add-ons. Low for reports up to 14,000 feet, and All, which extends to all altitudes. Customers who register their Sentry devices receive Low for no extra cost and a 50% discount on the All layer. Add-ons for customers without registered devices are $50 per year for Low and $100 for All. From globalair.com, FAA issues stricter safety requirements for Part 135 operators with the SMS final rule. The FAA issued a final rule for charter airlines, commuter airlines, air tour operators, and certain aircraft manufacturers requiring the implementation of a Safety Management System, or SMS. Airports across the country have been required to implement an SMS to help identify and mitigate safety risks before they result in an incursion or incident. The system provides a means to develop a structured, repeatable, and systemic approach to proactively identify hazards and manage risks. Incorporating SMS will allow these aviation organizations to better develop and implement mitigations that are appropriate for specific environments and types of operations. The final rule mandates that these organizations now develop an SMS within 1 to 3 years, depending upon the type of operation. The FAA has required U.S. airlines to have SMS since 2018, and many manufacturers have developed and implemented SMS, which has been accepted by the agency. From RobinsonHeli.com, Robinson Helicopter Company acquires Ascent Aerosystems. Robinson Helicopter has acquired Ascent Aerosystems. The acquisition reinforces Robinson's dedication to scaling innovation, accelerating new rotorcraft developments, and supporting diverse missions worldwide. By leveraging the expertise and resources of both companies, Robinson reinforces its leadership in the future of vertical flight systems and utility missions. Ascent Aerosystems, recognized for its efficient and compact coaxial helicopter drones, by the way, these are compact, they're relatively small, are designed for industrial, public safety, and defense applications, bringing a wealth of technological synergies that align with Robinson's strategic vision for growth and expansion into new markets. Through the acquisition, Ascent can now grow and scale by building its UAVs at Robinson's manufacturing facility in Torrance, California. From GeneralAviationNews.com, and this comes from a final NTSB report, overweight Diamond crashes killing all 4 aboard. The pilot rented the Diamond DA-40 with the intent to fly a multi-leg cross-country flight from his home base of Spanish Fork Municipal, that's KSPK, in Utah, with 3 passengers. The planned route of flight included stops at Cedar City Regional Airport and 4 other airports before returning. The airplane departed KSPK on the first leg with about 40 gallons of fuel. Recorded airport surveillance video at KCDC showed that the plane landed at about 4:15 p.m. and taxied to the self-serve pump. The pilot and passengers disembarked, and the pilot refueled, adding about 14 gallons of fuel. The pilot and passengers boarded the plane for the next destination, Bryce Canyon, KBCE in Utah, and taxied toward the runway. A pilot-rated witness who was driving westbound down Cedar Canyon reported that he observed the plane flying up the canyon and over the river at an altitude of about 300 feet above ground level. The witness stated that as the plane was about to pass over his position, it turned left and then right, and its maneuvers were quick and like a rocking motion. The witness added that the propeller appeared to be under power and not windmilling. Another witness saw the airplane bank really hard to the south back across the highway, as if the airplane were trying to turn around in the narrow canyon. The witness added that at that point, the airplane's wings were almost completely vertical and that the airplane didn't look like it had enough speed to pull off that maneuver. The airplane hit mountainous terrain along the southern edge of the canyon about 7 miles southeast of KCDC. The pilot and 3 passengers died in the crash. The weight of the airplane at the time of the departure was estimated to be about 128 pounds over the max gross weight. According to the performance information in the DA-40 flight manual and the assumed altitude and air density conditions, the airplane's climb performance would have been about 300 feet per minute. The calculated density altitude at the time of the departure was about 6,000 feet. The calculated density altitude at the accident location and the time of the accident was 7,200 feet. Probable cause, the pilot's failure to maintain obstacle clearance, which resulted in controlled flight into terrain. Contributing to the accident was the pilot's decision to operate the airplane above its maximum gross weight. And this sounded to me like the pilot perhaps had relatively low time. I searched for and found the NTSB report referenced in this article, and this pilot had just 91 hours of flight time, and 4 people ages 29 through 44 died in the crash. Also from GeneralAviationNews.com, Cessna 172 hits power lines after unstabilized approach. This too comes from a final NTSB report. The private pilot said his approach to land at the airport in Stockbridge, Georgia was unstabilized. When the 172 was about halfway down the 3,000-foot runway and about 150 feet above the ground, the flight instructor took control of the airplane, added full power, and attempted to go around. The CFI said he retracted 10 degrees of flaps once he thought the airplane established a positive rate of climb. However, the stall warning horn sounded. He lowered the nose of the airplane to gain airspeed, but the stall warning horn continued to sound. To avoid power lines and trees located off the end of the runway, the flight instructor turned to execute a forced landing on a road. He fully retracted the flaps, and the airplane clipped the power lines and hit the road. The private pilot, who was an aviation maintenance technician, said the engine was operating normally and that the airplane just did not have enough airspeed and altitude to clear the power lines. Probable cause, the CFI's delayed remedial action during an unstabilized approach, which resulted in an impact with power lines and a subsequent loss of control. And also from generalaviationnews.com, near miss blamed on pressure from ATC. And this comes from an ASRS report written by the pilot. He wrote, I was arriving at Pocono Mountains Regional Airport, KMPO, in Pennsylvania, and I have to smile because that was one of the airports on my long cross-country when I was a student pilot, via an active instrument flight plan on the RNAV-13 approach from the Volkio IAF and IMC under the control of Wilkes-Barre TRACON. Shortly after turning onto the final approach course, ATC requested that I cancel my IFR as soon as possible because there was an aircraft waiting for a release at KMPO, and he then instructed me to change to the CTAF. I changed to CTAF and announced that I was on a 10-mile final for runway 13. I announced again on CTAF that I was on a 5-mile final. I broke out of the clouds shortly after passing the FAF and changed back to the TRACON frequency and canceled my IFR flight plan. I changed back to CTAF and announced that I was on a 1-mile final for runway 13 and landed. While on my rollout, as I was approaching the crossing runway 5/23 intersection, I heard on CTAF aircraft Y departing runway 23. I immediately applied my brakes with maximum effort to stop short of runway 23. As I came to a stop less than 150 feet from the runway 0523, the other aircraft passed in front of me on their takeoff roll, resulting in a near miss. I was monitoring CTAF for at least 6 minutes prior to landing, except for the brief change back to the TRACON frequency for approximately 10 to 15 seconds to cancel my IFR, and heard no radio calls of any sort until the call from the other aircraft initiating their takeoff. From my perspective, there are several considerations regarding the cause of this near miss. The other aircraft was possibly unaware that I was landing on the crossing runway. They were aware but chose to depart anyway, assuming that I would land and hold short of runway 23. Presumably, the other aircraft was impatient because of the delay in their IFR release caused by my approach. I don't know how long the other plane was waiting for release, but it was at least 6 minutes because ATC advised me of such 6 minutes prior to my touchdown. Perhaps once I canceled my IFR flight plan, release was given to the other aircraft, and in haste they departed without having full situational awareness of other aircraft in the vicinity. Also, I did not have full situational awareness of the other aircraft, even though ATC told me that there was an aircraft waiting for release. In hindsight, I should have kept my IFR open until I landed and canceled on the ground. I felt that I was being a courteous user of the NAS by succumbing to the pressure from ATC to cancel quickly and cancel as soon as I was in VMC, but by doing so I allowed a situation to develop that had more risk than if I had waited and canceled on the ground. Going forward, I will not succumb to pressure from ATC to cancel my IFR at non-towered fields prior to landing unless I plan to fly a normal traffic pattern in VMC. And in other news from AIN Online, the IRS is using additional resources and new AI tools as it delves into the possible non-compliance issues with the largest U.S. corporations and partnerships, including in the area of corporate aircraft use. IRS Commissioner Daniel Werfel pointed to the recent announcement of plans to also begin dozens of new audits on corporate aircraft involving personal use. The IRS has concerns that the use of these jets is not being properly allocated between business and personal activities. And from AOPA.org, Progressive Aerodyne, the company that manufactures the Sea Ray amphibious light sport aircraft in kit and factory-built versions, has shut down production while it negotiates the possible sale of the company to an investor group, according to people familiar with the situation. From Dayton247now.com, the Greene County Regional Airport in Ohio was broken into. Mac Air President Ross McNutt said 11 of our aircraft had their avionics systems stolen from the aircraft. It's probably about $150,000 to $180,000 worth of equipment. This is about a third of the Mac Air fleet, which could impact the more than 300 club members and nearly 100 Sinclair College students. And finally, from globalair.com, Vertical Flight Society eVTOL directory reaches 1,000 designs of next-gen concepts. The Vertical Flight Society shared that the number of eVTOL aircraft concepts tracked in their World eVTOL Aircraft Directory has reached 1,000 from over 430 designers. The race to develop and certify an eVTOL continues, with companies all over the world working on innovative designs for a cleaner, lower-noise travel option. Electric propulsion will allow new aircraft concepts to have an enhanced performance, little to no emissions, reduced operating cost, and low noise. VFS held its first eVTOL workshop in 2014. When the website launched in April 2017, there were just 18 known eVTOL designs. Companies like Archer Aviation and Joby are racing to certify the first eVTOL. Both companies have solidified partnerships to establish infrastructure around the U.S. and other parts of the world to prepare for the influx of eVTOL air taxis. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few of my updates. And later we'll talk with Jason Stevens about what you need to know to train to become a glider towplane pilot. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And let's get to the good news. First, congratulations to Stephanie Baker. She posted this on our YouTube channel. She wrote, "This isn't directly related to this video, but to your channel overall. I did my first solo yesterday, and the 'You Can Always Go Around' song popped into my head on final during my first touch and go, and then every final thereafter. Thank you, because that annoying little song was very reassuring. It made me safe." Well, Stephanie, congratulations on your solo. And I love that song because it's an earworm, which means a catchy song that occupies your mind even after it's no longer being played. And if we can just get everyone to let that song get stuck in their mind, well, we'd have fewer accidents. And I think for the fun of it, I'll play the entire song at the end of this episode. And if you want to know the story behind the song, listen to episode 259, in which I talk with singer-songwriter and pilot Ken Dravis about his song. And if you appreciate Ken and the life-saving benefits he's brought to the aviation community by writing and performing that song, please buy the song from him right now and put a few bucks into his pocket. Just go out to kendravis.com or look for the link in our show notes. And just before I release this episode, I heard back from Ken Dravis about this letter in response. He wrote, "Good morning, Max. Wow, great letter in response to Stephanie. For me, writing songs that have a positive and lasting effect on someone is what it's all about. I have received iPhone videos from acquaintances over the years as Go Around was being played in numerous ground schools around the country. Air Canada asked permission several years ago to use it during training. Thank you for all you do." Well, thank you, Ken. Now, before we get to our conversation with Jason Stevens about what it's like to tow gliders, I'd like to share with you a few updates about the SR-22 accident at Paso Robles that we talked about earlier this week in episode 325, and about two older accidents that we've talked about in detail on this show. And I'll finish that discussion by asking you to make a specific commitment when you fly, so please stick around for that. First, regarding the SR-22 crash at Paso Robles, you may recall that aircraft, after receiving a clearance for the approach, failed to fly the hold at Havli, which was the IF/IAF, resulting in being significantly above the required altitudes for subsequent fixes. The aircraft's approach was unstable, including reaching the VNE never exceed speed of 208 knots on the approach, with a descent rate that reached 2,300 feet per minute. Now, fortunately, the pilot decided to circle back to runway 19, but instead lined up for runway 13 and then crashed between the two runways. Like so many things we talk about on this show, I often hear from you when you share things that I couldn't have known. A few hours after I released that episode, a listener wrote, "While I did not see the crash happen, I was first on the scene and helped rescue the pilot and passengers long before EMS ever arrived. Our main concern was the fuel leaking out of the wings, the energized aircraft, and the rocket parachute. I wanted to make a comment regarding the pilot. She was not actually controlling the plane, but is a CFI and was running the radios. The live ATC clips are pretty scary when you listen to them as a whole. I'm just glad no one was seriously injured." Well, thanks so much for your feedback, and thanks to everyone who contacts me. So in that episode, when you heard me refer to the person on the radio as being the pilot, that person was apparently a CFI and not the pilot, according to this listener. And now let's talk about the midair collision that occurred in the traffic pattern in Watsonville, California in 2022. We talked extensively about that accident in episode 243, and I produced a YouTube video that used radar data to show the tracks of these two aircraft. In that accident, a Cessna Twin 340 flew along straight-in approach and was still at 180 knots when it hit a Cessna 152 that had just turned from base to final. That's 60 knots faster than this aircraft had been on prior landings at Watsonville. All pilots and passengers were killed. The accident seemed stunning because while both pilots were announcing their position, they didn't talk to each other until moments before the accident. As I mentioned in episode 243, the Cessna 340 pilot reported that he was 1 mile from the airport and that he was looking for the traffic on left base. The Cessna 152 pilot stated that he did see the Cessna 340 and that it was behind him. About 13 seconds later, The Cessna 152 pilot stated that he was going around because you're coming at me pretty fast, man. The behavior of both pilots was surprising to me at the time, as both seemed to be acting inappropriately. The twin Cessna was blasting straight in at 180 knots, 40 knots faster than its landing gear speed, so even on a 1-mile final, it couldn't have configured the aircraft to land at that speed. Now, that made no sense to me and suggested that the pilot was lacking in situation awareness and possibly even impaired. The Cessna 152 pilot, who could see the light twin barreling toward him, turned base slightly earlier than on any of his prior 6 laps around the traffic pattern, probably because he knew the twin Cessna pilot was getting close. Now, what would reasonable pilots have done in this situation? I fly to Watsonville all the time. I can't ever remember making a straight-on approach to that airport. I usually fly over the airport, then start a descent, and then turn to the right so that I can enter on the 45 for left traffic to runway 20. A client of mine who regularly flies his Vision Jet to Watsonville told me at the time that he never flies a straight-in approach to Watsonville because, in his words, the airport is too busy. Instead, when he gets close to the airport, he turns a little to the left to aim at where the river and the freeway meet, which sets him up for a turn onto the 45 to runway 20. A better decision for the Cessna 152 pilot would have been to extend his downwind and follow the Cessna 340 to the runway, rather than turning base in front of him. Yes, aircraft flying straight in are supposed to defer to aircraft flying a regular traffic pattern, but it makes sense to get faster aircraft on the ground quickly, so I strongly recommend extending your downwind rather than turning in front of a straight-in aircraft and hoping that they go around. Well, the final NTSB report came out, and there are a few things we've learned that we didn't know at the time. One is the experience of the pilots. The Cessna 152 pilot was a 32-year-old male, and a private pilot with just 111 hours of total experience. That's not a lot of experience, and the pilot may never have been in a position where he had to decide what to do when a faster aircraft was flying a straight-in approach. The pilot of the Cessna 340 was a 75-year-old male with an estimated 1,200 hours of time. The NTSB apparently didn't have access to all his logbooks, as there's no information as to when he had a flight review, and the total time is estimated. But oddly, it does say that the pilot had 944.9 hours in the make and model of the aircraft, which is rather precise. I commented at the time that the pilot had only a private and a multi-engine rating and no instrument rating, surprising for a plane regularly flown into Watsonville, which sits next to the ocean, is often below VFR minimums. That also implies that he had relatively little total instructional time. For example, you might get a private in 60 or 70 hours and a multi-engine rating in 10 or 15 hours. So other than flight reviews, his total instruction could have been as little as 70 to 80 hours, and since he had 944 hours in the twin, that instruction could have been many years ago. Probably the most interesting part of the final report was the toxicology report for both pilots. I've told you in the past about an FAA study that found that 30% of all fatal accidents involve either illegal drugs, which was about 11%, and the other 19% were medications on the FAA's no-go list, so you can't fly with them. So there's a 30% chance of a pilot in a fatal accident being on drugs or banned medication, and if there are 2 pilots, well, when you run the math, there's a 51% chance that at least one of them was on drugs or banned medications. I won't go through the full toxicology report, but for the Cessna 152 pilot, it says that it detected THC, which is the primary major psychoactive compound of cannabis, otherwise known as marijuana. There were several other things detected, including a couple of metabolites of cocaine. Ironically, the toxicology report for the Cessna 340 pilot also detected THC in that pilot's blood as well. In the case of both pilots, the final NTSB report said that the low amounts of each drug were not considered causal to the accident. The NTSB probable cause was, quote, the failure of the pilot of the multi-engine airplane to see and avoid the single-engine airplane while performing a straight-in approach for landing. And we'll be back in a moment, but first let me ask you, are you flying an airplane equipped with the Garmin G1000 Prospective or the G3000 or G5000? If so, do you know everything there is to know about the system and its autopilot? I'm sure you've read the POH for your airplane from cover to cover, but have you done that for your avionics? Even if you know a lot about the G1000 or G3000 and the autopilot, there's probably more to learn, and you certainly don't want to be struggling to figure out the nuances of the system as you're flying in the clouds. People who've read my books tell me they are much easier to read than the Garmin manuals, Plus, they have a great index, so it's easy to look up any feature you're trying to figure out. To truly master a plane, you have to also master the avionics. So call to get my Max Trescott's G1000 and Prospective Glass Cockpit Handbook or my Max Trescott's G3000 and G5000 Glass Cockpit Handbook. The former is $34.95 and the latter is $44.95. Commit to doing that now and call 800-247-6553 to order. And I have some follow-up information on the crash of a TBM 960 at Truckee, California that we talked about in episode 322. But before I get to that, I want to mention briefly that there was another TBM that crashed this week. So 2 of these multi-million-dollar planes have been destroyed in less than a month, which has probably left the TBM owners and operators just reeling from these rare back-to-back accidents. The accident occurred on Wednesday at about 10:15 a.m. at KRDU, the Raleigh-Durham airport. Here's what ABC11.com wrote about the accident. A small medical plane crashed at the Raleigh-Durham International Airport, and according to a preliminary report from the FAA, the plane attempted to land, bounced, began to go around, and crashed. 2 people were inside the plane at the time of the crash. One of them was trapped for a short time before first responders were able to free them. Both were taken to the hospital for treatment after being removed from the aircraft. The plane was a UNC Air Operations medical plane. The 2 people on board were a UNC physician and the pilot. The doctor was released a few hours later, and the pilot remains hospitalized in fair condition as of Thursday. UNC Health says it remains optimistic he will make a full recovery. The plane, a TBM 850, is owned by Medical Air Inc. Now, I looked briefly at the data for this crash. The aircraft was landing on runway 32, which is 3,570 feet long. It ended up in the grass, but it's hard to tell the location for sure, but it appears that it went off the end of the runway. Weather 9 minutes after the accident was reported as winds at 290 at 6, visibility 10, and clouds broken at 9,000. So weather doesn't appear to be a factor, though it looks like a small front passed through the area after the accident. There was one small yellow cell of precipitation near the airport, though light rain didn't start until 2.5 hours after the accident. So if the FAA report is correct, this was a bounced landing followed by a poorly executed go-around. And as I mentioned a week or 2 ago, pilots in general need to practice more go-arounds and more missed approaches. And now here's that follow-up information on the crash of the TBM 960 at Truckee last month. You may recall that aircraft flew the RNAV GPS 20 approach when it was snowing, and the visibility was below the 1-mile minimums for the approach. The pilot went somewhere between 200 and 250 feet below the MDA, and then abruptly climbed 500 feet and leveled off. He then started a right turn. The plane continued flying mostly level at 6,750 feet, plus or minus about 100 feet for the next minute, when it should have been climbing to 12,000 feet. The pilot then appeared to lose control, and the aircraft made a slight turn back to the left and crashed at a high descent rate. I was under the impression at the time that this was a very poorly flown missed approach, though I did offer up another possibility when I said, since the aircraft leveled off instead of continuing to climb, it's possible the pilot decided to circle to land. However, the aircraft was nearly 500 feet below the Category B circling MDA of 7,220 feet. Well, sadly, we now have some new information that the pilot apparently was circling to land rather than flying the published missed approach, and hence was violating the FAA rules by circling well below the MDA. And my thanks to the several of you who contacted me about this accident to share new information. By the way, often when I discuss accidents with other CFIs, one of us will comment something along the lines of, and he probably did it before, but got away with it and figured that it was safe to do. Risky behaviors beget more risky behaviors, and apparently that may have been the case with this pilot as well. The accident we discussed occurred on March 31st, 2024. However, multiple listeners pointed out to me that this aircraft did essentially the same thing under very similar circumstances just 8 weeks before on February 2nd. The difference between that flight and the accident flight is that the pilot successfully landed. The other differences were minor. On February 2nd, 15 minutes before the aircraft landed, the weather was 1 mile visibility, so about a quarter to a half mile better than on the accident flight 8 weeks later, and overcast at 1,100 feet, or 200 feet higher than on the day of the accident. There was also light snow and mist, and the altimeter was 29.80. Note that the circling minimums for the RNAV GPS 20 approach at Truckee in Category B are 7,220 feet, or 1,316 feet AGL, which is 200 feet above the cloud level reported for that day. And you're required to have 1.5 mile visibility. So the accident aircraft apparently violated the visibility minimums as well as the circling MDA minimums on both days. On the February 2nd flight, the pilot flew the approach down to 6,470 feet, so almost exactly at the straight-in minimums, which are 582 feet AGL. The aircraft then made about a 40-degree turn to the left to circle to make right traffic to runway 2. At the very highest point in the circle, the aircraft reached 6,550 feet, which is 670 feet below the Category B circling minimums and 570 feet below the Category A minimums. The aircraft then successfully landed on runway 2. So, is it a violation to fly below the circling minimums before you're in a position to land? Yeah, heck yes. That's a per se violation of the FARs. And there's other evidence that on the day of the accident, the pilot was circling below the MDA rather than flying the published missed approach. I talked with someone who had visited the wreckage site, and he noted that the landing gear was in the down and locked position. So, sure, it's possible the pilot was flying the mist and forgot to retract the landing gear. But given his prior illegal circling approach 8 weeks before, it lends credence to the idea that he was again circling below the MDA on the day of the accident, rather than climbing out on the published missed approach. Last week we talked briefly about normalization of deviance, and that may apply to this accident. Normalization of deviance is a phenomenon where people, groups, or organizations accept a lower standard of performance until it becomes the norm. And having successfully flown a circling approach below the required MDA at least once, doing that again in the future would start to feel normalized, especially if other pilots were doing the same thing. I also talked with someone who talked with another aircraft owner at Truckee who knew the accident pilot, and he described the pilot as being very conservative and safety conscious. I'll let that sink in. I've only lost one client to an accident, and all I did with that pilot was to fly instrument approaches with him for currency purposes. I never taught him any of his ratings or did any transition work into new aircraft types. And I think everyone would have described him as a very conservative, safety-conscious pilot. And yet, after the funeral, we learned of some dangerous low-altitude flying this pilot had done before the accident. So let's think a moment about the accident pilot. I imagine that pilot was indeed safety-oriented and safety-conscious and did many things right. But I have to wonder why he might have felt safe violating the FARs and going well below the FAA circling minimums on an instrument approach. We'll probably never know why he did that at least once and possibly was trying to do it again on the day of the accident. Did he come up with the idea on his own? Or did someone at Truckee say something like, yes, that circling MDA is way too high, and it's perfectly safe to circle below that altitude? And where did this idea come from that it was okay, and worse yet, that it was safe to violate that FAR? People, if you think that you fly safely and conservatively all the time, but occasionally you purposely violate an FAR, any FAR, you are kidding yourself. And if you think, well, I got away with it, what's the harm? Well, here's the harm. Yes, you cheated on the rules, but who did you cheat on? Well, the only person you cheated on was yourself. Well, and your family members and friends who might someday be unlucky enough to be on board if you cheat on the rules and don't get away with it and you have an accident. Or worse yet, kill someone on the ground who is sitting safely at home watching TV. If you like to think of yourself as a safe, conservative pilot, but you occasionally break a rule and feel that's okay, at least admit to yourself that you're rationalizing and that you're not being as safe as you could be. Now, here's a thought experiment I'd suggest, and it's one that I actually remember going through myself sometime around the time that I got my instrument rating. I remember thinking, I wonder which of the FARs are okay for me to break. Think about that for a moment. And then, without thinking about any particular rule, my next thought was, well, if I pick one rule that's okay to break, what's the second or third rule that might be okay to break? And if I do that, how do I know when to stop? In other words, how do I know when I've reached the important rules that I shouldn't break? Now, all of those thoughts occurred in just a few seconds because I quickly concluded that going down that thought path would be a very slippery slope. In other words, I knew that if I started breaking one rule, I wouldn't know where to stop. So fortunately, I quickly concluded that I should never purposely break any FAR, ever. And that's important because, as I said a week or two ago, the FARs are written in blood. Many of those rules were created because a pilot died. And these days for me, I make it a game. It's a game of trying to follow every FAR every time I fly. And on rare occasions, having to follow a rule may seem inconvenient. For example, I'm sure on February 2nd and again on the accident day, March 31st, it would have been inconvenient to have to fly the published missed approach and land at Reno instead of Truckee because the clouds were too low to legally circle to another runway. But on those rare occasions where I'm inconvenienced by having to follow the rules, I don't regret it. Instead, I revel in it because it makes me proud that 1, I know the rules. 2, I recognize that I had a tough decision to make because following the rules would inconvenience me. And 3, that I made a correct decision, followed the rules, even though I knew it would inconvenience me. And look at the opposite pattern that can emerge if you don't follow a rule and you break it so as to not be inconvenienced. What are you likely to think afterwards? You might think, well, that was a smart decision. I just saved myself time by breaking that nuisance rule. And you might also conclude, well, that worked out, so obviously it's safe to break that rule, and I can still think of myself as a safe pilot anytime I choose to break that rule. Slippery slope, isn't it? So here's my challenge to you. If you think you're a safe pilot who flies conservatively, and I hope you do, make a commitment now to never purposely break an FAR, even if it's going to inconvenience you. Because that inconvenience, whatever it might be, is going to be tiny compared to the inconvenience of having your family take care of your funeral arrangements. Now, does that seem a little harsh? Well, good, it's meant to be. Flying is a heck of a lot of fun and we should enjoy it, but it's also extremely demanding, not so much in the physical skills of flying a plane, but in the mental skills of making good decisions every time. And unfortunately, it's also very unforgiving when we're faced with tough decisions and make the wrong choices. Someone recently commented that the airlines are not hiring pilots for their flying skills as much as they are hiring them for their decision-making skills. So keep that in mind and continue to think very carefully when making some of the difficult decisions we need to make when we fly. Now, I'd like to share an email that just came in from a new PayPal supporter, Phil Lieber, which is relevant. He said at the end of the show, episode 325, he made a comment that GA flying is the hardest flying, heaviest workload with the fewest resources. I couldn't agree with you more, and it's really good to hear this from someone else. I'm a major airline captain and fly with my wife, who is a corporate jet captain, in our Piper PA-32. At the end of the day, flying in our plane around the Bay Area, we frequently comment that it's more challenging than flying at work. With all these challenges, it's not surprising that the general aviation accident rate is as bad as it is. And after flying with some of my hangar neighbors, I'm surprised it's not worse. The challenges faced by GA light aircraft pilots is just as serious as those flying jets for hire. Thanks for a great show. Phil, thanks so much for your comments and for taking the time to write. In a moment, we'll talk with Jason Stevens about what it's like to tow gliders with a towplane. But first, I wanted to ask for your help. This is a listener-supported show, and it's really the support from people such as you that lets me take time off from teaching, which is my primary job, to spend time researching and producing this show for you. And it takes a lot of time, easily 20 hours per episode. And I've produced 2 episodes for you this week, and I hope you found some nuggets of value in both of them. So I'd like to invite you to join the club now and become part of the community that makes this all possible. And it's easy to do. Just stop what you're doing and go out to the web to aviationnewstalk.com/support. And I bet you've said, oh, I'll do that later. But have you actually gotten around to doing it yet? Sometimes we just never get around to later. So please do it now. Go out to aviationnewstalk.com/support, where you'll find 4 different ways that you can donate to support the show. And if you choose to donate via Patreon, you'll get some goodies at the various contribution levels. And regardless of the paid level you choose, you get access to a different version of this show where you won't hear me asking you again to support the show. And of course, when you do, I'll read your name on the show. Thanks so much for your help. Now, aviation is a really small community, so listen carefully and see if you know any of these people. These people made one-time donations via Venmo, including Bonnie McCoy, Chris Sugden, and Mark Sletton. We also had some one-time PayPal donations from Alan Miller, Phil Lieber, Mark Killian, and a large one-time donation from Eric Nelson. Thank you so much for your donations. We also have a one-time donation via Zelle from Donald Ram. And finally, someone who's supporting us each month through PayPal. That would be Gabor Simon, or perhaps if you're from Europe, Gabor Ziman. Thanks so much to everyone for donating, and a huge thanks to all of you who sign up to support the show on a monthly basis. Coming up next, our conversation with Jason Stevens, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let me tell you a little about Jason Stevens. Jason is the president and chief flight instructor of Arizona Soaring, located near Phoenix, Arizona. He's also an 8-time National Glider aerobatic champion. And now here's our conversation with Jason Stevens. Jason, welcome to the show. Great to have you here.
Thank you.
So we're going to be talking about glider towplane piloting, if you will. Tell us what it takes to get checked out as a pilot of a glider towplane, and what are you looking for when you're trying to hire a pilot into that position?
So to tow gliders, you have to have a private airplane certificate or greater. You have to do 3 flights in a glider, and you have to get an endorsement to operate as a tow pilot from a fellow tow pilot. So it's an endorsement not from an instructor, but from a tow pilot, which is kind of a relatively unusual thing.
Well, actually, the first thing that sounded unusual was a private certificate. So you're telling me you don't need a commercial to do this?
Correct. That is correct.
Okay. And what kind of minimum hours do most operators look for? How many hours would they like to see somebody have before they hire them on to do this job?
Well, in most cases, operators will probably want their prospective tow pilot to have a commercial rating, but not always. If they're familiar with the person, a private is typically just fine, as long as they're a good pilot, of course. So that means most of the new tow pilots are probably going to have a couple hundred hours of total experience. And most tow planes are taildraggers, so most operators are probably going to want to see at least 25 hours in tailwheel aircraft in order to tow gliders.
And is that going to be driven by insurance requirements?
In some cases, yes. In other cases, maybe it's just security for their asset that you're getting to fly, and they need to protect that asset. Without a tow plane, the glider operator is out of business, basically.
And tell us, what kind of tow planes do you use?
So at Arizona Soaring, we operate 3 Piper Pawnees. 2 are 250 horsepower versions. 1 is a 260 horsepower version. I also have a Husky A1 that I used for tow pilot training and as a backup tow plane.
And explain why that one gets used for training versus the Pawnees.
So the Piper Pawnees are single-seat aircraft, so we obviously can't give dual instruction in them. So that's where the Husky comes into play, as it's a 2-seater.
And for somebody who is looking to build hours and experience as a tow plane pilot, how much time do they tend to accrue within a month or a year?
Well, it'll vary quite a bit from operator to operator. Some operations are seasonal, others are year-round, like ours. But even the year-round operators are semi-seasonal, you could say. A typical day of towing might be 20 to 30 tows in a day. So that might be, 3.5 to 5 hours of flight time, depending upon the altitudes that the gliders are towing to. So you can rack up a lot of time if it's your full-time job.
And what about variation within the week? Is there a lot more towing on weekends and very little during the week, or what's that like?
Yeah, at most places, the weekends are busier. At some operators like ours, we're equally busy during the week as on the weekends. So there's not quite as much variation. Like our operation is mostly training, so it's pretty steady business every day.
So tell us a little bit about what a tow pilot does on a typical flight, and also talk about some of the safety issues that they need to be concerned about.
So some key factors in a tow flight are keeping the glider within easy gliding range of the home airport at all times. So you have to choose what path you take during the climb to make sure that the glider pilot is always able to get home, whether they hop off at an inopportune time or there's a rope break, they need to be able to get home. So that's something the tow pilot has to think about constantly. Generally, you're looking at the relative angle down to the airport to judge when you should make your next turn and how far. You also have to be a real stable platform for the glider pilot. You need to have constant pitch attitude control and shallow banks in the turns, and generally minimize the number of turns to make it easier on the glider pilot. But the pitch control is really, I think, the key thing that needs to be maintained.
Tell us about the takeoff process, kind of from start to finish.
Sure. So once the glider is ready for takeoff, their wings will be balanced by a wing runner, and then the glider will wag their rudder as the signal that they're ready to go. Generally, then the wing runner swings their arm in a circle to signal the tow pilot that it's all clear to begin the departure. So in the tow plane, I start feeding in the power smoothly but consistently, usually reaching full power in about 6 seconds or so. It's important not to advance the power too rapidly, because then you get a big glut of rotating air that can cause a sudden wing drop of the glider. So smoothness on power application is important. As we accelerate and the glider lifts off the ground first, that's about the time that my tail likes to naturally come up off the ground and I get up onto the 2 main gear. And then when the airplane feels like it's ready to lift off, you just gently raise the pitch and initiate the liftoff and smoothly bring the pitch up to set your tow pitch attitude.
And what about emergencies? What kind of emergencies do you train tow pilots to deal with?
Well, the main emergency that we talk about is really more for the glider pilot, and that's a rope break, which could happen at any time, either due to the glider pilot being overly stressful on the tow line, or you've got some unseen damage to the tow line. Alternatively, you could have an engine problem with the tow plane. That's probably the next most likely problem that you would encounter. If it's something relatively slow acting, like high oil temperature, let's say, then you have the option of waving off the glider by rocking your wings or through the radio telling them to end the tow, so you can then reduce power and start cooling off the oil or the cylinder head temperature. I tell my tow pilots, if they have something that's a bit more severe, let's say you lose a mag or the engine starts to quit, they should just simply release the glider immediately and then deal with their problem. The glider will be fine. They'll figure it out. But the tow pilot needs to take care of the tow pilot primarily.
And you do offer a program for training tow pilots. Describe that for us. What's the cost and the typical amount of time and some of the things that are covered in there?
So the typical tow pilot training is a little over $1,000, and that includes 3 flights in a glider, which are required by FARs, and then a couple hours in the classroom reviewing tow signals, regulations, operational procedures. And then we go out and we do either 3 simulated tows or 3 actual tows with the Husky. Generally speaking, I put one of my staff in a glider so we can do actual tows, because I think while you can simulate the tows pretty well, it's obviously more realistic to actually tow a glider than to simulate it. So that's my preference. And we'll do 3 tows. And as far as that goes, if they're good, then they're done.
And if somebody wanted to come down to the Phoenix area to do this with you, how long in advance would they need to schedule something?
Oh, usually I would say at least a month in advance, probably. It's a one-day thing, but it's pretty much a whole workday for us to get everything done easily. And it's not something that mixes in with our normal operations that easily. So I tend to want to do the tow training, the actual tows at the end of the day after spending most of the day in the classroom.
And so what pilots walk away with is an endorsement?
That's correct. Yep. So I'll give them a specific endorsement authorizing them to act as a tow pilot.
Great. So they can then go back to their home airport and work with a local operator?
That's correct, whether it's a local commercial operator or a club.
Super. Where do people go to find out more about you and Arizona Soaring?
Well, our website is azsoaring.com. That's got all sorts of information about training, rides, the aircraft in our fleet, and estimated costs and where we are.
Jason, thanks so much for joining us here today.
Hey, my pleasure.
And my thanks to Jason Stevens for joining us here today. You can find out more about him and his work and about Arizona Soaring at azsoaring.com. And just a reminder that I love hearing from you, and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. And of course, I also want to thank everyone who supports the show in one of the following ways. We love it when you join the club and sign up at aviationnewstalk.com/support to support the show financially. You can also do that at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. We also love it when you leave a 5-star review on whatever app that you're listening to us on now. And of course, if you're in the market for a headset, please consider buying a Lightspeed headset and using one of the links in our show notes, because if you use those links, they will donate to help support the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.
Well, there I was that one fine Sunday afternoon, just me and my airplane in a little airport we'd never been to before. We were on short final and nothing was looking right. I was seeing red over red and white over white. I couldn't seem to remember how that saying went anyway, but I was staring straight down at the runway, and all I could think of was I was setting myself up to ungraciously dismantle this perfectly good little airplane, and then off in the distance I heard a voice, and I think it was that of my flight instructor saying, "You can always go around. You can always go around if it don't look right coming down. Don't wait until you're sideways, maybe sliding on the ground. You can always go around." I know back when I learned to fly, my instructor was yelling in my ear, "Power in, carb heat cold, climb out and pitch, flaps to go, take it round the patch, one more time again." But I know now, he was showing me that just because the nose is pointing down, if it doesn't look right, give it one more try. You can always go around. You can always go around. If it don't look right coming down, don't wait until you're silent, baby, sliding upside down. You can always go around. You're coming in, you see you're high and fast, but your mind is set on somehow getting down. The runway leads to grass that leads into trees, little beads of sweat are dripping from your brow. You still got time, simply change your mind. Would sure be nice to fly this